The stars flickered outside the cockpit like cold fireflies in an endless void. Ezra Fawk gripped the controls of the Raven blade, his fingers trembling with a tension he hadn't felt in years. He didn't need to check the scanner to know they were being followed. The Nexus patrol ship wasn't hiding its presence, broadcasting its dominance with a slow, deliberate approach. "Ezra!" A voice crackled through the comms. It was Lien, her tone sharp enough to cut through the static. "They'll intercept in 3 minutes. What's your plan?" Ezra smirked bitterly. "Plan? We fly faster and hope their scanners aren't as good as they think they are. This is why we didn't want you." She snapped back, her irritation palpable even through the distortion. "You always gamble on luck. We need strategy, not blind hope." Ezra's jaw tightened. He glanced at the cargo bay monitor, where the cylindrical case containing the pulse catalyst was secured. He hadn't even wanted this job. Lien had dragged him into it, threatening to expose his smuggling routes to the Nexus unless he cooperated. Now here they were, 2 minutes from death or capture, with nothing but a half-baked escape plan. "Fine," he said, flicking a switch. "We'll play it your way. Hold on to something." The Raven blade bucked violently as he dove into the nearby asteroid field, the ship's reinforced hull groaning under the strain. The patrol ship hesitated, its larger size ill-suited for the tight turns and sharp angles of the field. Ezra grinned. "See? Strategy. Idiot," Lien muttered, though there was a note of reluctant approval in her voice. As they weaved through the maze of tumbling rocks, Ezra's mind wandered back to Earth's last broadcast. Enough, one word, sent across every frequency, every channel, a final act of defiance before the Nexus fleets descended. Most dismissed it as a dying gasp. Others, like Lien, believed it was a call to arms. Ezra? He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. A sudden jolt snapped him back to reality. The Raven blade shuddered as a glancing shot from the patrol ship's cannons tore through the aft shields. Warning lights flashed across the console. "Shields down to 20%, Lien reported grimly. "They'll have us in the next pass." Ezra gritted his teeth. "Not if we finish this first." He pushed the engines to their limit, threading the ship through a narrow gap between 2 massive asteroids. The patrol ship hesitated, its pilots likely debating the risk of pursuit. That hesitation was all Ezra needed. The asteroid field ended abruptly, opening into a vast, empty expanse of space. Ezra fired the thrusters, putting as much distance as possible between them and the patrol ship before it could reacquire them. He glanced at the scanner. No pursuit. Lien's face appeared on the monitor, her expression a mix of relief and exasperation. "You're reckless, you know that? And you're welcome," Ezra shot back, leaning back in his chair. "Now, can we get this over with? I'd like to live long enough to regret helping you." Lien didn't respond immediately. She studied him, her sharp green eyes searching for something beneath his flippant exterior. "Do you even care what we're doing, Ezra? Or is this just another job to you?" Ezra's smirk faltered. He looked away, pretending to check the controls. "I care about staying alive. Whatever you're planning with that thing in the cargo hold, just make sure it's worth all this trouble." "It's not just worth it," Lien said, her voice low and fervent. "It's everything. If we succeed, the Nexus won't just lose a battle, they'll lose control of the entire galaxy." Ezra raised an eyebrow. "Big talk for someone who can barely keep their ship in one piece." Lien's lips thinned, but she didn't rise to the bait. "You'll see. When the time comes, you'll understand." Ezra didn't reply. He leaned back in his seat, staring out at the endless stars. He didn't like the weight of her conviction. It reminded him too much of the idealism he'd lost years ago, back when he still believed humanity could fight back against the Nexus. The silence stretched until Lien finally broke it. "We'll reach the rendezvous point in 2 hours. Get some rest. You'll need it." Ezra nodded absently, though he knew sleep wouldn't come. His mind was already racing, thinking of escape routes and contingencies. He didn't trust Lien, didn't trust her cause, and certainly didn't trust whatever plan Earth had concocted. But for now, he had no choice but to see it through. 2 hours later, the Raven blade approached a derelict mining station orbiting a barren moon. Ezra frowned as he studied the structure. It looked abandoned, its exterior pockmarked with age and neglect. "This is the Great Rebellion's secret base?" he asked dryly. Lien ignored him, her attention focused on the docking procedures. As they locked onto the station, a faint hum filled the ship. Ezra tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. The airlock opened, revealing a group of figures in patched uniforms and scavenged armor. They stood in a loose formation, their weapons trained on Ezra and Lien as they stepped out. "Relax," Lien said, raising her hands. "They're with us." One of the figures stepped forward, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek. He nodded curtly to Lien before turning his gaze to Ezra. "This him?" Lien nodded. "Ezra Falk, former Earth Navy. He's the best pilot we've got." Ezra forced a smile. "Nice to feel appreciated." The man didn't smile back. He looked Ezra up and down, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped aside, motioning for them to follow. The group led them through the station's dimly lit corridors, past makeshift barracks and storage rooms filled with crates of supplies. Ezra couldn't shake the feeling of unease. These weren't soldiers, they were survivors, clinging to a desperate hope. They reached a central chamber, where a large holographic display showed a map of the Nexus-controlled territories. A woman stood at the console, her back to them. "Dr. Veritas," Lien said, her voice respectful. The woman turned, her sharp features and piercing gaze immediately commanding attention. Ezra recognized her from the broadcasts, one of Earth's top scientists, rumored to have vanished after the Nexus crackdown. "So," Veritas said, her voice calm but firm, "you're the infamous Ezra Falk." Ezra shrugged. "Infamous seems generous. I prefer mildly notorious." Veritas didn't smile. "You've been briefed on the mission?" "Only that it's insane," Ezra replied. "Which, considering the company, tracks." Veritas stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "Insanity is what they called Earth's survival. Yet here we are." Ezra didn't have a reply to that. "We leave for Carinth in 48 hours," Veritas continued. "The catalyst will change everything. If we succeed, humanity won't just survive. We'll lead." Ezra met her gaze, his usual smirk fading. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost, hope. "Let's get it done," he said quietly. And in that moment, for better or worse, he was all in. The ship hung in the black void like a shadow, its sleek, patched hull barely visible against the starry backdrop. Inside the cargo hold, Ezra Falk paced while Lien worked at a terminal, her fingers flying over the keys with a speed born of urgency. "This is insane," Ezra muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Do you even have a plan, or are we just flying straight into the jaws of death?" Lien didn't look up. "We're infiltrating the most fortified planet in the Nexus Empire with a stolen cargo ship, an untested weapon, and a skeleton crew. Of course, there's a plan. It's just not one you're going to like." Ezra stopped pacing and stared at her. "Not one I'm going to like? You mean the part where I'm the distraction while you and your little science experiment waltz into the Nexus capital? Or the part where we all die horribly if you're wrong?" She turned to him, her green eyes sharp. "If you've got a better idea, I'm all ears." He opened his mouth to reply but hesitated. He didn't have a better idea. That was the problem. Every part of this operation felt like a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to topple an empire that had crushed countless rebellions before. And yet here he was, right in the middle of it. Again. "Thought so," Lien said, turning back to the terminal. "Look, I don't care if you trust me, Falk. But you don't need to. You just need to do your job." "My job?" Ezra asked, his voice rising. "I didn't sign up to be a martyr, Lien. I'm a pilot, not some revolutionary hero." She glanced at him over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "Maybe it's time you stopped running from what you are." The words stung, and Ezra felt his temper flare. "You don't know me. Don't pretend you do." "I know enough," she said, her tone softer now. I know you used to believe in something. I know you lost people, good people, because of it. And I know you blame yourself for failing them. But if we pull this off, if the catalyst works, you'll finally have a chance to make it right. Ezra clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. And if it doesn't work? What then? Lien didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. Before Ezra could press further, the ship's comm system crackled to life, and Dr. Veritas's voice echoed through the cargo hold. We've reached the outer perimeter of Carinth. Prepare for insertion. Ezra exhaled sharply and made his way to the cockpit, Lien close behind him. The main display showed Carinth in all its intimidating glory, a sprawling network of towering spires, orbital platforms, and shimmering shields that made it seem more like a fortress than a planet. Nexus warships patrolled the area in tight formations, their sleek designs a stark contrast to the Ravenblade's patched and battered exterior. Tell me we've got a way past those shields, Ezra said, sliding into the pilot's seat. That's where the catalyst comes in, Veritas replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. It emits a low-frequency resonance that temporarily disrupts shield harmonics. But we'll only have a 10-second window once it activates. 10 seconds, Ezra repeated, shaking his head. No pressure. Lien leaned over the console, her eyes scanning the readings. Just get us through. We'll handle the rest. Ezra muttered something under his breath and tightened his grip on the controls. The Raven blade eased forward, its engines humming softly as it approached the shield's outer edge. Veritas's voice came through again, this time with a countdown. Activating the catalyst in 3, 2, 1. A low hum reverberated through the ship, and the shimmering shield ahead of them flickered briefly before a small section dissolved, creating a narrow corridor just wide enough for the Raven blade to slip through. Ezra didn't hesitate, pushing the engines to full power and guiding the ship through the gap. The moment they were inside, the shield reactivated, sealing them in. We're in, Ezra said, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Good, Veritas replied. Now the real work begins. The Raven blade descended toward the planet's surface, weaving through the labyrinth of spires and platforms. Automated turrets tracked their movements, but their stolen transponder codes seemed to hold, keeping them off the Nexus's radar for now. Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too easy, that at any moment, something was going to go wrong. They landed on a remote docking platform, far from the central spire where the Nexus High Command was located. The team disembarked quickly, each member carrying a piece of the catalyst's control array. Veritas led the way, her movements brisk and purposeful. Stay close and stick to the plan, she said, her voice low but firm. We can't afford any mistakes. Ezra followed reluctantly, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered at his hip. The platform was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the faint hum of machinery in the distance. The group moved swiftly through the maze of corridors, avoiding security checkpoints and automated patrols. Veritas seemed to know the layout by heart, her confidence unwavering. As they approached the central spire, the tension in the air became almost palpable. Ezra could feel his heart pounding in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he didn't. For all his doubts and fears, something about Veritas's determination kept him moving forward. They reached a large chamber filled with rows of glowing consoles and towering data banks. Veritas motioned for the team to set up the catalyst's array, and they began working quickly, connecting cables and aligning components. Ezra kept watch near the entrance, his eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. How long is this going to take? He asked, glancing over his shoulder. Not long, Veritas replied, her hands moving deftly over the controls. Just keep them off us until we're ready. Ezra nodded, though he wasn't sure how he was supposed to hold off an entire planet's worth of Nexus forces if it came to that. He tightened his grip on his sidearm and tried to focus, his mind racing with 1,000 worst-case scenarios. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to see a group of Nexus soldiers entering the chamber, their sleek armor glinting in the dim light. Their leader, a tall, imposing figure with a scarred face, stepped forward and leveled a plasma rifle at Ezra. "Step away from the console," the leader commanded, his voice cold and mechanical. Ezra didn't move. His heart was pounding, but his hands remained steady. "You really think you can stop this?" he said, his voice laced with defiance. "You're too late," the leader sneered. "Surrender now, and we might let you live." Ezra smirked. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing." Before the Nexus soldiers could react, Lien appeared behind them, her rifle blazing. The chamber erupted into chaos as the team fought to hold off the soldiers while Veritas worked frantically to activate the catalyst. Ezra ducked behind a console, firing at the advancing troops with a precision born of desperation. "Almost there!" Veritas shouted over the din. Ezra gritted his teeth and kept firing, his movements swift and calculated. He wasn't a hero. He never wanted to be. But in that moment, with everything on the line, he fought like one. "Move faster!" Lien's voice cut through the chaos as the team scrambled to secure the final nodes of the catalyst. Plasma bolts zipped past, their scorching heat singing the air. Ezra pressed his back against the console, breathing hard, his fingers fumbling as he reloaded his weapon. He glanced at Veritas, who was bent over the catalyst's control array, her movements precise but frantic. "We need another minute," Veritas shouted, her voice calm despite the storm of violence around them. "That's a luxury we don't have," Ezra muttered, popping out from behind the console to take a shot at an advancing Nexus soldier. The soldier crumpled, but 3 more took his place, their sleek armor glinting under the harsh lighting. Lien ducked behind a pillar, her rifle humming as she returned fire. "We're getting pinned down here, Falk! Do something!" Ezra scanned the room, his mind racing. He spotted a cluster of fuel cells stacked against the far wall. "Cover me!" he yelled, sprinting toward them before anyone could argue. He slid to a stop and aimed his sidearm, firing off 3 quick shots. The fuel cells erupted in a fiery explosion, sending the nearest soldiers flying and creating a temporary barrier of flames. Lien glanced at him, a grudging respect flickering in her eyes. "Not bad. Save the compliments for when we're not about to die." Ezra shot back, turning his attention to Veritas. "How much longer?" 30 seconds, she said without looking up, her hands a blur over the control panel. "Just hold them off a little longer." "Easy for you to say," Ezra muttered. He ducked as a plasma bolt sizzled past his head, leaving a scorch mark on the console behind him. "We're running out of cover!" The Nexus soldiers regrouped quickly, their disciplined movements a stark contrast to the chaotic firefight. Their leader, a towering figure with a glowing insignia on his chest, barked orders in a guttural language. The soldiers began to advance in unison, their rifles raised, their formation tight. Ezra's heart pounded. He fired at the leader, but the plasma bolt dissipated harmlessly against his energy shield. "They've got reinforcements," he called out, his voice tinged with desperation. "We're not gonna make it." "Yes, we are," Lien snapped, stepping into the open and unleashing a barrage of suppressive fire. The Nexus formation faltered as several soldiers fell, but the leader kept advancing, his shield absorbing the onslaught. "Fuck!" Lien shouted, her voice raw. "Get the catalyst online!" "I'll hold them!" Ezra hesitated, torn between helping Lien and protecting Veritas. He cursed under his breath and made a decision. Sliding across the floor, he joined Veritas at the control panel. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep this relay stable," Veritas said, pointing to a flickering monitor. "If the energy flow disrupts, the entire system will overload, and we'll lose everything." Ezra nodded, his hands flying over the controls. He didn't fully understand the catalyst's technology, but years of piloting had given him a knack for managing complex systems under pressure. He focused on the fluctuating energy levels, adjusting the parameters with a precision that surprised even himself. Behind them, the firefight raged on. Lien fought like a cornered animal, her movements fluid and fierce. She took down soldier after soldier, but the odds were overwhelming. The leader closed the distance, his shield shimmering as it absorbed her attacks. "Lien, fall back!" Ezra yelled, his voice cracking. "You can't take him alone!" "I don't need to," she replied, her tone grim. She pulled a grenade from her belt and hurled it at the leader's feet. The explosion rocked the chamber, momentarily blinding everyone. When the smoke cleared, the leader's shield was gone, but so was Lien. She lay motionless on the ground, her rifle clattering from her hand. Ezra felt his stomach drop. "No!" He started to rise, but Veritas grabbed his arm. "Stay here," she said firmly. "She did her part. Now do yours." Ezra clenched his fists, his chest heaving with suppressed rage. He forced himself to focus on the relay, his hands trembling as he stabilized the energy flow. "This better work," he growled through gritted teeth. "It will," Veritas said, her voice steady. She tapped a final sequence into the control panel, and the catalyst began to hum, its resonance building to a low, throbbing pulse. The chamber vibrated with the raw power of the device, and the remaining Nexus soldiers hesitated, their confidence wavering. The leader, bloodied but alive, staggered to his feet. His glowing insignia pulsed as he raised his rifle, aiming directly at Veritas. Ezra saw the movement out of the corner of his eye and acted on instinct. He lunged forward, tackling Veritas to the ground just as the shot fired. The plasma bolt grazed his shoulder, searing his flesh, but he ignored the pain. "Stay down!" he barked, his voice raw. He rolled to his feet, drawing his sidearm with his uninjured hand. The leader charged, his massive frame barreling toward Ezra like a juggernaut. Ezra fired, each shot finding its mark, but the leader didn't stop. They collided, the impact sending Ezra sprawling. The leader loomed over him, his rifle raised for the killing blow. Ezra gritted his teeth, his hand scrabbling for a weapon, anything. His fingers closed around a fallen blade, and he swung it upward with all his strength. The blade pierced the leader's armor, and the towering figure froze, his expression one of shock before he collapsed. Ezra staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his shoulder. He turned to Veritas, who was already back at the control panel. "Is it done?" "Almost," she said, her fingers flying over the keys. "Just one more sequence." The catalyst's hum grew louder, its resonance building to a crescendo. The air crackled with energy, and the remaining Nexus soldiers began to retreat, their discipline giving way to fear. Veritas pressed a final button, and the catalyst unleashed a pulse of raw, harmonic energy. The effect was instantaneous. The Nexus soldiers dropped their weapons, their advanced armor systems failing. The lights in the chamber flickered and died, replaced by the eerie glow of the catalyst. Outside, the shielded towers of Carinth dimmed, their defensive grids collapsing. The pulse spread outward, rippling across the planet and beyond, shutting down every Nexus system it touched. Ezra slumped against the console, his vision swimming. Did we win?" Veritas nodded, her face pale but resolute. "The catalyst worked. The Nexus is crippled." He closed his eyes, a shaky laugh escaping his lips. "About time something went right." A faint groan caught his attention. He turned to see Lien stirring, her hand clutching her side. Relief flooded through him as he staggered over to her, helping her sit up. "You're a terrible shot," she muttered, her voice weak but laced with humor. Ezra grinned despite himself. "You're welcome." Veritas joined them, her expression somber. "We need to move. The Nexus will regroup eventually, and we can't be here when they do." Ezra nodded, helping Lien to her feet. "Let's finish what we started." As they made their way back to the Raven Blade, the catalyst's pulse continued to spread, a silent declaration to the galaxy. Humanity had said enough, and no empire would survive it. Ezra gripped the controls of the Raven Blade as it shot through the void, the engine straining under the stress of maximum output. Sweat slicked his brow, and every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. The catalyst had worked, and the Nexus was reeling, but the mission wasn't over. Far from it. Their escape was still in doubt, and the fate of humanity hung by a thread. Shields at 30%. Lien's voice crackled through the comms, laced with pain but steady. We're not out of this yet. Ezra's jaw clenched. He could feel the faint tremors of the ship's hull as it absorbed hits from the Nexus fleet scrambling to stop them. The catalyst's pulse had disrupted their systems, but some of the warships were still functional, and they weren't letting the Raven blade go without a fight. Hold together, you stubborn piece of junk, Ezra muttered, coaxing the ship through a narrow asteroid belt. Behind them, 2 Nexus fighters gave chase, their sleek forms weaving effortlessly through the debris. Veritas, he called, his voice sharp. Tell me you've got another trick up your sleeve. In the corner of his HUD, Veritas's face appeared, pale but resolute. The catalyst's secondary pulse could destabilize their targeting systems, but it'll take time to charge. You need to keep us alive until then. Ezra barked a laugh, bitter but determined. No pressure, then. Lien's voice cut in, hoarse but unyielding. We've made it this far. You're not getting us killed now, Falk. Ezra glanced at her through the rearview monitor. Lien was strapped into her seat, clutching a makeshift bandage pressed against her side, her face pale but her eyes burning with defiance. I've got no plans to die today, he said. But if we do, at least we'll make it memorable. The ship jolted violently as another plasma bolt grazed their aft shields. Warning lights flared across the console, and the engine hummed ominously. Ezra grimaced, his hands flying over the controls as he guided the Raven blade into a sharp dive. The pursuing fighters hesitated, their pilots struggling to adjust to the erratic trajectory. Come on, Ezra muttered under his breath, his mind racing. He spotted a dense cluster of asteroids ahead, their jagged shapes casting long shadows. Lien, can you man the rear turret? She forced herself upright, wincing as she moved. I'll manage. Ezra maneuvered the ship into the asteroid cluster, the narrow passages forcing the fighters to slow their approach. Lien activated the rear turret, her shots precise despite her injuries. The first fighter took a direct hit, spiraling into an asteroid and exploding in a fiery burst. Nice shot, Ezra said, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Don't get cocky, Lien shot back, but he could hear the faint trace of pride in her voice. The second fighter was more cautious, weaving through the asteroids with practiced ease. It fired a volley of plasma bolts, one of which struck the Ravenblade's port engine. The ship lurched violently, and Ezra fought to keep it steady. Veritas, how much longer? He demanded. 30 seconds, she replied, her voice strained. Just hold them off a little longer. Ezra muttered a curse under his breath and pushed the ship into a steep climb, the damaged engine sputtering in protest. The fighter followed, its weapons locking on for another shot. Lien, now would be a great time for another miracle, he said, his tone half joking but laced with urgency. Working on it, she replied, her focus unshaken. She adjusted the turret's angle and fired a sustained burst. The fighter evaded, but the maneuver left it exposed. Lien seized the opportunity, firing again. The shot clipped the fighter's wing, sending it into an uncontrolled spin. Ezra let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Remind me never to underestimate you. Just keep flying, Lien said, slumping back into her seat. Veritas's voice came through the comms, calm but urgent. The secondary pulse is ready. Firing now. The catalyst emitted a low, resonant hum that reverberated through the ship. A wave of energy radiated outward, invisible but devastating. The remaining Nexus ships faltered, their targeting systems scrambling, and their engines sputtering. The pursuing fighter exploded as its systems overloaded, a silent burst of light against the darkness. Ezra glanced at the scanner. The immediate threat was gone, but the Nexus fleet was still regrouping in the distance. That bought us time, but we're not in the clear yet. What's our exit plan? The pulse disrupted their long-range tracking, Veritas said. If we can reach the shadow of that moon, we'll be able to jump to hyperspace undetected. Ezra nodded, his hands steady on the controls despite the exhaustion weighing on him. Hold tight. We're getting out of here. The Raven blade limped toward the moon, its engine struggling but determined. Ezra pushed the ship harder, every second a battle against the odds. The Nexus fleet loomed in the distance, their ships moving like predators circling wounded prey. But they didn't fire. The catalyst's pulse had done more damage than Ezra had hoped. They reached the moon's shadow, the ship slipping into the safety of its gravitational well. Ezra activated the hyperspace drive, the console lighting up with the familiar sequence. He exhaled sharply, his fingers hovering over the final command. "Jumping in 3," he said, his voice steady. 2, 1. The Raven blade surged forward, the stars stretching into lines of light as they entered hyperspace. The tension in the cockpit broke, replaced by a stunned silence. They had done it. Against all odds, they had survived. Ezra leaned back in his seat, his body finally relaxing. He glanced at Lien, who was slumped in her chair, her eyes half closed but her expression triumphant. Veritas appeared on the monitor, her calm exterior betraying a hint of relief. "It worked," Veritas said, her voice quiet but resolute. "The catalyst worked. The Nexus is crippled." Ezra nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "For now." Veritas met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "This is just the beginning. The Nexus will regroup. They'll adapt. Then we'll be ready," Lien said, her voice hoarse but filled with determination. "This isn't the end. It's the start of something bigger." Ezra looked at her, then back at Veritas. He felt the weight of what they had done, the lives they had risked, the lives they had saved. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. "Let's make it count," he said quietly. The ship hurtled through hyperspace, carrying with it the spark of rebellion, the defiance of a species that had finally said enough.